Hello, good afternoon. We are just waiting for a few more of our speakers today, and then we'll try and get started pretty close to 2 o'clock or just a couple minutes after 2 o'clock. So thank you.
Did you guys have trouble getting in? I did. The links that were on the presser didn't work. Huh.
I just took it off of Scott's calendar invite. Or Jason Koenig's calendar invite. I know I'm only an interim, but I'm following through with all of my mentors, and I didn't wear a tie. But then, of course, Rico Munn, the most well-dressed superintendent in Colorado, wears a tie. Yep.
There's Corey right there. Yeah, I've got a board meeting tonight, so I'm in uniform.
And I do not.
Hey, I still roll Aurora style, so we're always wearing a tie, Rico. What do you mean?
There you go.
A tie for a board meeting tonight. I go back to my Aurora days, and this is dress code.
It was about my fifth year was the first time I didn't wear a tie on any work day.
Hey folks, it's Susanna. I'm sorry I'm camera off.
But do you have a tie?
You can't.
On my shoes.
Okay, it looks like we're all here, so we'll go ahead and start. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Scott Siegfried. I'm the superintendent of the Cherry Creek School District. We appreciate you joining us, as our hope is to share information with the community regarding what we have learned from operating schools during the first semester of this school year, and many of the items we will need to successfully reopen in-person learning in January. And we come to you because we can't do this alone. Success truly is dependent on all of us. Before I start, however, I want to briefly introduce those you'll hear from today. First, Chris Godowski, Superintendent of Adams 12 5-star schools. Brian Ewert, Superintendent of Littleton Schools. Susanna Cordova, the Superintendent of Denver Public Schools. Corey Wise, Interim Superintendent of Douglas County Public Schools. Christopher Hsu, the Interim Superintendent of Jefferson County Schools. Rico Munn, the Superintendent of Aurora Public Schools. Dr. Bill Berman, the co-chair of the Metro Denver Partnership for Health. And Mike Johnston, the president and CEO of Gary Community Investments and COVID Check Colorado. As we begin, I want to be clear. We don't represent all superintendents or school districts. Many of our colleagues continue to excel and find successful pathways through this time. We all must be responsive to our communities. Our goal today is to share our perspective as the leaders of districts representing nearly 400,000 students in the Metro Denver area. Since the outset, we have remained committed to using data, science, and facts to guide our decision-making processes, and not politics, pressure, or perception. We value and have planned for the health and safety of both students and staff, and believe it is critical to update early plans from this summer with new learning. I'd also like to thank the governor for his support throughout this year and the work of his Return to School Task Force. I'm anxious to read the details included in their report and better understand some of those details which were referred to, but initially believe some of the thoughts coincide with our learning and insights on how to move forward successfully. Our collective belief and goal are clear. We all want students in classrooms with excellent Colorado teachers. For their continued academic and social emotional growth, it is critical we work as a community to create the conditions so that we can be successful. We have 3 weeks to collectively ensure that students can return and remain in the classroom moving forward, and I encourage us all to prioritize schools. So as we start today, we're going to start with Dr. Bill Berman. Dr. Berman is the Director of Denver Public Health and a Professor of Medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Dr. Berman is going to share updates and guidance from the Metro Denver Partnership for Health. Dr. Berman.
Thanks, Scott. And it's a great opportunity to be here. I'm here as a representative of the Metro Denver Partnership for Health, and that's a collaboration between the local public health departments of the 7-county Denver Boulder metropolitan area. I think the first point to start out with, Scott mentioned, and that is we've learned a lot since March, and for that reason, we just today updated our guidance about K through 12 education. And I really have 3 key points to talk quickly with you about. First, that when it comes to COVID, kids are different in important ways. Secondly, that schools can be safe during the pandemic. And thirdly, that certainly schools are affected by community transmission rates, but schools don't drive community transmission rates. And we think that should lead all of us to put a very high priority on reopening schools as a public health and indeed as a community goal. So let me come back to those points. First, when it comes to COVID, kids are different in important ways, particularly the youngest children. So the youngest children have lower risks of becoming infected with COVID in a variety of studies using a variety of ways of assessment around the world. Secondly, young kids particularly appear to have a lower chance of transmitting COVID to others. And then finally, as these educators can tell us better than me, young kids probably have the most to gain from in-person learning. And as a health official, I would only point out that there's this inextricable and very close relationship between education and health. They're not two different things. They're two sides of the same coin, in my view. The second thing we've learned since March is that schools can be a safe place during the pandemic. And really, that's just a demonstration of something that's been found in other parts of our society, like medical care. And that is that this concept of what we call layered protection works. No single layer is adequate by itself. When we add them all up, they can provide a high degree of protection from transmission. And so these are things you've heard about again and again: symptom screening, rapid evaluation, including testing of those who have symptoms, universal masking or face covering, hand hygiene, distancing. Those aren't sexy, but they work really well to prevent transmission. And the data that this group will go over that will show you that in the experience in the Denver metro area during the fall, when schools were open during times of very active COVID, they were safe places for school staff and for students to be. And I'd also just point out that those same measures, those same layered treatment or layered prevention measures, I think will work very well to prevent other viral infections that are all too common in schools, things like influenza. And so I think this is going to be a safe year for students in Denver. And then finally, let me come back to this issue about, do schools cause or drive community transmission? And I reflect back to a call I was on with many of these same individuals back in March. And the analogy we were using was influenza, because we just didn't have any information about COVID. And because schools can be a place where influenza transmission is really revved up in a community, we worried about that. And that's part of the reason that schools were closed in March. Well, we now know that that's not true, that there are very important differences in the transmission of influenza and COVID. And now we have very good data from our own school systems and really from around the world that show that schools are definitely affected by community transmission rates. The higher the rates are, the more cases there will be among students and staff. But the vast majority of those cases are acquired in the community and in the home, not in the school. And to me, the clearest demonstration that schools aren't the driver of transmission comes from countries like France, where they had a very serious surge of COVID in the fall. It was controlled with community mitigation measures, and schools were kept in session that entire time. So I think that's, from a health perspective, that's why we feel strongly that in-person learning should be a high priority in our community. We think we should start with the youngest children. We know that these school districts will assure the correct use of layered protection. Mike Johnston will talk about the options for using expanded testing as an adjunct to those basic measures of protection. And in the end, the responsibility for the control of community transmission that will very much facilitate in-person learning is on all of us. We control what happens in the community. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Scott.
Thank you, Dr. Berman. If anybody wanted to see the report or the updated guidance, where would they find that?
It's on the Colorado Health Institute website.
Thank you. I appreciate your support and being with us today. Now I'm going to ask Chris Godowski, the superintendent of Adams 12 5-star schools, and Brian Ewert, the superintendent of Littleton schools, who are going to discuss the operational impact of higher community incident rates on schools.
Thank you, Scott. I think Brian's going to lead us off on this piece.
Sure. So as you heard from Dr. Berman, we now know that schools do not meaningfully contribute to the spread of COVID, and that's very important. We are not a super spreader environment in any of our schools. And as you know, recent studies of schools and our individual data, the Colorado multi-district quarantine data, all of this demonstrates that when schools universally implement the recommended and multiple overlapping safety strategies, COVID is not spread to any meaningful degree. So schools are highly controlled spaces, and they are enforced and reinforced with overlapping health strategies. And we can control where people sit, we can control where they go, the directionality of movement, who they are with, and also their cohorts and their groupings. And that's all significantly different than what you'd find in the community. And we've learned a lot since August. What we thought were going to be measures of school safety in August of 2020, they're better identified now as measures of operational viability. Based on actual data collected by school districts in Colorado and a growing scientific base, and with the support of the Metro Denver Partnership of Health, we can identify ranges of operational capacity and additional levels of protection to offset increased community spread. Our data and experience demonstrate that at some point above a community incident rate of around 500 to 750 per 100,000, that it becomes increasingly difficult for our schools to maintain in-person learning. The tenuous house of cards that we're living in within this COVID environment literally begins to collapse operationally. So while the COVID cases and transmission rates in our schools are exponentially lower in our schools and in our community, uncontrolled community spread and the resulting quarantines are highly, highly disruptive and are really the biggest obstacle to our return to in-person learning. The wide quarantine nets that are cast when there is a single positive case within a student group or within a staff member group, inside the school or outside the school, it makes operability nearly impossible at a certain point. So keeping students in schools is not necessarily a safety concern related to COVID, but rather it's an operational issue. Our school districts closed due to the complexity and the demands of tracing COVID cases as required, and the disruption of mass quarantines as required, and the lack of available adults that were available to safely supervise our students. It also disrupts just the general operations like maintenance and custodial, transportation, nutrition services, and our clerical staff. All of that is impacted by the net of the quarantine. And another issue is the seasonal illnesses. This has compounded the issue. When we have staff that have symptoms of the common cold or influenza, they're required to stay home, and that adds to the problem of adult supervision. So all of our plans to reopen in person really is completely dependent on our community's ability to control the COVID spread. It's really an operational issue for us. Chris?
Thank you, Brian. Three things I would add beyond what Brian has shared here. The first is that as I taught the colleagues in our weekly and sometimes twice weekly update calls, it was clear that each one of us was tracking data about how far the incidence rate and positivity rate had progressed within our communities. And we talked about experiences in which our schools no longer could operate. In our situation, Adams 12, within a week's time, we had 7 elementary schools where more than 30% of the staff were out on quarantine. And we saw a really strong correlation between these community incidence rates that Brian has talked about and the inability of us to sufficiently staff our schools. We often reach that point at slightly different places, as Brian has mentioned. For some, they would indicate that they started to have those difficulties become insurmountable at around 400 cases per 100,000, others close to 700 per 100,000. Oftentimes, what was behind that is that districts often have different staffing resources. So if you're a school district that might have more revenue from override measures and you've invested in greater amounts of staff, you might have more staff available to cover as staff go out on quarantine. You might have a greater cadre of substitute teachers in your district that allows you to fill in those gaps. Or you may have a greater or lesser number of staff, either school by school or district-wide, that you've devoted to remote learning, because each one of us have stood up and provided fairly extensive remote learning options for our families this first semester. So those differences often correlate about where you're at in this pain point, and when you reach the breaking point correlated to case incidents in your community. So that's just one piece to emphasize, and that's why in our past experience and likely what you'll see in January forward, we'll come back at different times and have different thresholds, and it largely depends on what staffing resources that we have. The second point that I would make is it might be easy to draw the inference or conclusion that because we largely represent large school systems and we're district administrators that operate large systems, that smaller systems, smaller schools, different settings might not have these same challenges. And what I've seen in my experience in Adams 12 is that's not the case. In Adams 12, we have 7 charter schools. 4 of them are chartered by us. 3 of them are chartered by the State Charter School Institute. They have independent boards of directors and independent management teams. They've all adopted their own models that they feel like are going to be most responsive to the needs of their school community during the pandemic. They all have different risk tolerances and beliefs about how to best manage schooling in the pandemic. And yet the common denominator is that each of those 7 schools also were closed for in-person schooling and have been doing remote schooling from the Thanksgiving break forward, many of them quite a bit earlier than that. One of our charter schools had a single day of in-person schooling at the high school level. So if you approach this conversation with the belief that, gosh, those central office administrators in large systems just aren't smart enough to figure this out, they're not working hard enough to make it work, their teachers union doesn't want to come back in person to make this fly, I can tell you from our experience with our 7 charter schools, that's simply not the case. Whether you have a different board, a different leadership team, you're smaller in size, at a certain point when you have high incidence of community transmission and you have so many of your staff out on quarantine, you start to transition slowly and slowly and slowly into a place where your primary focus is on education, to a place where your primary focus is on child supervision, and you hold that together as long as you can. And the next thing you know is even the child supervision place you can no longer do safely and reliably for your families. We all found ourselves in that spot this fall. And so while I'm hopeful about the expanded testing that we're gonna have available in January that the governor's talked about today and that Michael will talk about further in a few minutes, while I'm appreciative of the revised quarantine standards that I think will give us greater flexibility, while I look forward to the vaccine coming forward and being something that can serve our educators and inoculate them against this virus, what I know and continue to believe is that all of those things I've just described will give us some incremental benefit in our ability to remain in person. But the most important part is going to be to bring down this community transmission and these high rates of incidence. Without that, if we remain at 1,100 cases per 100,000 in Adams County, as we did yesterday in January, our goal of having consistent, productive in-person schooling will no longer be viable once again. So all of us doing our part to reduce community transmission is super important. And then the final thing I would share in this space is what I've seen in my community, and I'm sure is true of my colleagues on this call, is back this summer and early fall, what we often heard from parents is some in-person is better than nothing. We'll take anything, even if it's half day a week, 1 day a week of in-person. If we have to cut out sports, if we have to cut out band and music, if we have to make a lot of different changes and sacrifices, we're good with it because something is better than nothing in person. What I hear now is people no longer in that space. They want to get back as close to the normal routine and operations that we once had. And the reason why people have adopted some of the models that I've just described is that they're good ways to mitigate some of the disruption that comes with quarantine. But what we know too is that in many cases, they leave us short of delivering what families and students badly want us to do, which is to provide all of the services, all of the supports, and to do it in a consistent fashion. And again, it's going to be imperative for us to do that. We want to do it badly, but it's going to be imperative for us throughout the region to reduce our case rates so that's a viable option come January. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Susana Cordova, the superintendent of Denver Public Schools, is going to talk about quarantine guidelines necessary to maintain operations at a higher incident rate. And Susana, I know your camera doesn't work, but everybody will be able to hear you.
Great. So thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of you. As Brian and Chris shared, the challenge that we faced this fall primarily related to our ability to operate our schools while dealing with the impact of quarantines, particularly for our educators. Now, because of the new data and guidelines that have emerged, schools will have the ability to do targeted quarantines at all levels, including middle and high schools. This will give us the ability to keep more of our staff in school while simultaneously maintaining a safe environment for our teachers and students. Additionally, in alignment with the updated CDC guidance, students and staff will have the ability to test out of quarantines on day 7. This strategy will allow students and staff to safely return to class sooner and will also lessen the impact on the ability that we have to keep our schools open. This reflects the data that very few, as Scott shared, less than 1% of our students tested positive while they were in quarantine. And finally, thanks to Governor Polis and COVID Check Colorado, students and staff will have access to no-cost COVID tests through this partnership with COVID Check. It's been available for our staff, but the extension of testing to students will enable us to create an environment where we can catch COVID early, minimizing the already low impact of spread within our schools and creating a sense of security for our educators that they can safely come into our schools and teach our students as we know they desperately want to. Thank you.
Thank you, Susana. That's a perfect segue to introduce Mike Johnston, the president and CEO of Gary Community Investments and COVID Check Colorado. As Susana said, COVID Check has been a great partner to school districts since the onset of this last school year, and we're excited for this partnership to increase and include students as we move forward.
Thanks, Scott, and just a huge thank you to the superintendents on this call and to Dr. Berman. I think you all have some of the hardest jobs in the country right now, and your ability to try to do everything you can to support families and students in the community has been heroic. And so we are deeply in debt to all of you. As a public school parent myself, very happy for all the work you've done. So yeah, quickly, Gary Community Investments, our commitment is to support low-income kids and their families getting access to opportunity. And so we've been very active in the education and workforce development world. As a former teacher and principal myself, we knew that one of the challenges for schools to reopen was going to be access to safe and regular testing. And we believe that educators should be at the front of the priority list for that testing, as well as eventually for the vaccines. And so we started partnering with these districts in August to be able to provide regular diagnostic screening for teachers. And so since August, we've provided more than 150,000 tests to educators. That's enabled many districts that have chosen to use it to have their teachers tested regularly every 2 weeks for us to continue to monitor their health. And as Dr. Berman said, those results have been very, very encouraging to show that schools are actually some of the safest places in the state right now. For most of those months, that prevalence rate was about 0.5%, and even at the highest, never rose above 5%. So it's been a fraction of what the generally community prevalence rate has been throughout this process. But we knew, listening to the district partners, we needed a couple of things. One was to continue to provide staff testing. The second was, to Susanna's point, to provide this critical service of testing for students who are in quarantine and had been exposed. And so we will now be partnering with any districts that want to do that, so that if you have a student who's been exposed, they could come at day 5, get access to a test, by day 7, get results back, be able to come back to a school district if they have, in fact, show that they're negative and be able to re-enter school. That's critical. And then the third is to do a regular surveillance of diagnostic screening of students, so that we could take percentages of students and be testing them on a regular basis. We have a testing protocol called Saliva Direct, which is a saliva-based protocol developed by Yale University. It is what the NBA used to run the bubble when they were doing the playoffs. That would allow us to partner with districts to do school-based administration of those student testing, so we can bring tubes to schools. The nurses and their delegates can oversee a sample where a student just spits into a small cup. They collect the samples. We can get those to labs and get results back in about 24 hours. So we think this capacity enables the districts to be able to open in the safest possible way, to keep an eye on both staff transmission or staff prevalence as well as student prevalence. We've been very grateful for the state's tremendous partnership. CDPHE has partnered with us to make this testing available for free over the last 2 months, and they've committed in their publication this morning that they want to continue to make this community-based testing available to the districts we're partnering with for free going forward. So very excited about that step, and delighted to be a partner any way we can to these folks doing the hard work to try to get families back to work and students back to school.
Thank you, and thank you to COVID Check for being an outstanding partner since the onset of this pandemic with schools, and we continue to look forward to our work going forward. Now I'd like to introduce Christopher Hsu, the interim superintendent of Jefferson County Schools, and Corey Wise, the interim superintendent of Douglas County Schools. I believe that Corey will share some thoughts around advocacy for prioritizing educators for the vaccination at the top of phase 2.
Yeah, thanks so much. You know, as we listen to the operational impacts and what we need to help stay in school and be stable, and we listen to the health mitigating factors that also helps us, we've learned transitioning in and out has been problematic. It's hard on student learning, it's hard on parents, and it's hard on our economy. Education is critical. The needs for our student learners are at our forefront, and really prioritizing our youngest learners and most impacted learners is critical. So we really want to advocate for our staff, our school staff, our bus drivers, our teachers, our educational assistants, to be able to provide that education in person. And if we can move our teachers and school staff up a tier and get those vaccinations earlier, that's going to be huge and a game changer, not only for education, but also for our society and our community. We'd really like to not only say the need to get it, but also how soon, and prioritize our youngest learners and those teachers and staff to provide that education. You know, when we think about prioritizing and moving up the tier, we don't want it to decrease the value of others, but we also want to emphasize the value of our teachers and school staff to make this happen. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share not only what's needed, but also advocate and plan for what's next. Because as we get that opportunity, accessibility of vaccinations for our schools, it's really going to increase the opportunity to sustain this and not push out and interrupt and disrupt the learning that's been happening.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And now Rico Munn, the superintendent of the Aurora Public Schools, will discuss the impact of COVID on our budgets and funding and the need for additional resources.
Let me take a minute and thank all of my colleagues, Dr. Berman, Mike Johnston, everyone for being here and for coming together as colleagues. And also I want to take a moment, I know on behalf of all of my colleagues, to thank all of our staffs, all of our teachers, our bus drivers, our custodians, our nutrition workers, all of our administrators who have been incredibly flexible and creative to try and figure out how to educate kids through this pandemic. We've done some amazing and creative things over these last several months, but those have also been things that were new and expensive to do in our spaces. And so we want to continue to advocate for the resources that our students need, that our communities need in order to do this critical work. I want to thank the governor and his team for continuing their support for the testing. We know that's critical to make sure we understand the progression of the virus and how to keep our students in our buildings and everyone safe in our environments. But as you saw this morning, the Colorado Department of Education released preliminary October count numbers. And for the first time in 30 years, we as a state are declining in enrollment. And overall enrollment decline statewide of 3.3%. That, with the additional expenses that we are experiencing because of COVID, are going to be significant impacts on all of our budgets. We want to make sure that state and federal legislators keep in mind the need to address those things, to respond to the issues of the pandemic, and to support our long-term funding needs, including things around PPE and taking care of ventilation in our buildings, but also looking ahead to the summer, where we know we'll have additional opportunities for students who are struggled with remote learning to provide intervention opportunities to support our students on education and individual educational plans who have special needs, and for all of our kids who need to get back into the skills and back into the practice of school. We want to ask our federal and state partners and our leaders to make sure they're investing in our students and in the future of public education. Again, thank all of you for your interest and your time. And again, thank you to my colleagues for coming together to rally around this issue.
Thank you. So in summary, schools are very controlled environments. And because we understand and respect the science of COVID, we have universally implemented multiple overlapping safety strategies that have shown to work. Because of this approach, COVID does not spread in schools to any meaningful degree. COVID does come into schools from the community and does impact our ability to operate. And increased student and staff testing and changes to quarantine protocols can help us maintain operations at higher incident rates. Our goal is to return students to in-person learning and keeping them there. Prioritizing educators for vaccination at the top of phase 2 helps us to ensure this moving forward. And we're hopeful that commitment will be made to our teachers. So now at this time, we can take a few questions. If you would like to raise your hand on the app or type into the chat, we'll try and manage that. But while we're getting set up for that, again, just want to echo Rico's appreciation for our staffs, tens of thousands of staff members across these districts and across the state of Colorado, from our teachers, our paraeducators, bus drivers, have risen to the challenge of this year and done an exceptional job. And we greatly appreciate them and support them as well as all of our students and community. So with that, if we have some questions, we'd be happy to take. Okay, there's one question. Can you provide more information on the ability to increase testing capacity at schools? Will all districts be able to do surveillance testing? How long are test results taking to come back right now? And what can be done to improve on that? Mike Johnston, if you want to answer that with some specificity, that'd be great.
Sure. We've had tremendous success with the district partners that are on this call and others around turnaround times. So right now we've been doing standard PCR tests, which are nasal swabs. We run them at drive-through testing sites. Teachers can drive to the sites, get them. Takes only a couple minutes to get it done, and test results usually back in about 36 hours. The new saliva direct protocol would be faster. It could be 24-hour turnaround. We have labs in Colorado that do those. And again, those are, you spit into a small tube, makes it much easier to collect samples. So for school-based collection, that makes it simpler. So we are excited to, we're continuing to work with the partners that are on this call who want to do that. And then we'll be talking with the state about expansion to other districts if they are interested. But we think for districts who think that's an important part of their strategy, we want to provide it. As Dr. Berman said, that is only a supplement to all of the key core practices all these leaders are doing, things like social distancing and masking and keeping track of students' contacts and exposures and seating charts and all the things that they're doing. So it's an addition that we think can be a very effective one. And I think Colorado will be the most probably ambitious statewide school opening plan in the country if we can do this and do it well.
Thank you. Another question related to testing. When asked about getting rapid testing and more resources to school districts, the governor said that schools should first reach out to public health department, and if no success, reach out to the state. Have there been any issues in getting access to those rapid tests or additional resources needed to ensure safe in-person learning? Mike, I'll ask you to respond as well, but I will just say from my perspective, the superintendent of the Cherry Creek School District, we have been very fortunate to be able to provide ongoing, frequent tests with good turnaround time to all of our staff when needed. And we've worked with our health department. They have supported us throughout this, but really our direct partnership with COVID Check Colorado is what has led to our success and what I would believe will lead to our success in the future.
Just a quick thought, and Dr. Berman has forgotten more about the testing world than I know, so he can jump in with additional thoughts. But I would just say on the antigen tests, they are available as rapid antigen tests. They are less accurate than PCR testing. What we're doing is actually lab-driven PCR testing. And so the antigen tests are designed to cover for lack of accuracy with frequency. And so you're meant to be administering them 2 or 3 times a week, probably to students or staff, because you might not always get they might be a false negative or a false positive. And so what we've done is focus on PCR testing with very fast turnaround, because it is 100% accurate, and you know exactly whether you have the presence of the virus. So we've been able to, with these district partners, provide regular access to PCR testing with quick turnarounds. I think antigen tests could be a helpful part of the solution, particularly for potentially rural districts where it's harder to get access to testing sites. That would be a question for the state. We're not currently using antigen testing in our partnerships, but I'm sure others are, and I'll leave it to Dr. Berman if he has more thoughts on that.
I agree, Mike. And the only thing I would, sometimes there's a terminology issue. Rapid to me means results within half an hour. But I would also say, I guess I've called quick testing, which is results back the next day, is highly useful. And I think PCR testing with results available within 24 hours, to me, is the best testing that we can do. And that's why we're so fortunate to work with COVID Check Colorado and get that kind of service.
Thank you. And I just would put one last plug in for those communities, those of us that are going to utilize testing to help keep schools open and identify asymptomatic spread potentially, really to ask our parents to be a part of helping us with that solution and to engage in that testing with your students. And it does 2 things. It protects our school and the environment, our ability to operate, but it also protects you as a family to know if there's a positive individual in your household. So please utilize those tests and be part of our common solution. Next question, you mentioned a drop in enrollment. Do you know where the students went? Rico, do you want to talk about that one? It just as I guess it might be as much of a guess right now as anything, but any thoughts you have?
No, just looking at the CDE report that came out this morning, we saw a significant uptick in students who are opting to homeschool. We know that obviously Colorado is a state that benefits often from students moving here over the summer, and likely we saw a decline in movement this past year. So we continue to evaluate that, as everybody does, and try to understand what the long-term impact will be for our students and for our districts.
Thank you. Another question, one point of contention during the fall was confusion around when students would be learning remotely versus in person or hybrid based on COVID-19 circumstances. Which metrics are you using now to monitor that format? What do you plan to do differently this semester in communicating those standards to your family? And I believe that we all developed a metric-based approach, really focused on the data first semester. But again, we all live in different contexts, different virus spreads in our communities, and so had to make different decisions. I would tell you our learning with the health department at this point is really focusing in on incident rate. And that's why we spent today talking about that is the most valid and reliable measure we have as it impacts operational viability. I think at the same time, it's also important to look at the directionality of cases. Right now in Arapahoe County, we're about 845 incidence rate out of 100,000, but cases have been coming down. And again, we're optimistically positive that that's going to continue in that way. And so at an 845 with downward trend, that seems that we could probably operate in person successfully. At the same incidence rate, if the cases are going up, I don't think that would be very viable. And so we'll have to look at the combination of those measures, but really that incidence rate around 500 or slightly greater, it makes it much more difficult to operate. Not less safe, more difficult to operate. And you can find our individual approaches to that on our own individual school district websites. But that is kind of the common framework that we're utilizing moving forward. How much resistance to testing have you encountered among parents, families? Has there been a barrier? To date, we really haven't opened up a lot of testing to students. It's been provided when students are symptomatic. Locally here, staff have utilized it significantly across the metro area, as Mike Johnston shared the numbers. And again, that's, as we open up in January, I believe a significant strategy to be successful moving forward. And we'd ask our parents to be a part of that solution with us. And again, we can't compel, we won't require, but we need partnership with our communities to be successful. Next question, Superintendent Munn referenced the budget troubles districts may face in light of decreased enrollment in public schools. On a related note, how do superintendents on this call plan to continue funding COVID-related expenses in January and beyond that they've so far covered with CARES Act dollars? Rico, do you want to talk about that one again, or anyone else?
Obviously, I think when we made the commitments that we did at the beginning of the school year, we had to plan that out and plan it for our budgets. That's one of the long-term impacts we'll all have to, figure out how we address as we deal with the decline in enrollment. Some of that will also, we hope, be supported by additional relief dollars by state and federal legislators. You heard Mike Johnston talk about an ongoing commitment to providing some of that testing. And so it's going to be a combination. We as a community writ large have to come together to support that.
Thank you. And a related question, are you expecting the state to provide more money for testing, contact tracing, PPE? Do you need financial support to reopen? I'm hopeful, based on hearing the governor's press conference just a short while ago, that there will be some additional support for school districts. We believe these are things we need to do to be able to successfully operate, and we are hopeful that the state partners with us to support those additional measures. Question, will all the districts represented on the Zoom be able to do rapid testing at all students who are instructed to quarantine? If so, when will the districts begin? Will that access to rapid tests come solely through COVID Check Colorado or through other agencies? And will the rapid test for students be less accurate than the nasal swab PCR test? Mike Johnston, I'll ask you to talk about some of the technical aspects of that.
Yeah, you bet. So the short answer is yes, we'll be partnering with all the districts on this call who want to do it to give them access to the three things. One is both regular staff testing, diagnostic screening. The other is to students who are in quarantine and want to test out of quarantine. And the third is to some diagnostic screening of students. This structure, this Saliva Direct protocol is as accurate as the nasal swab because it is still a PCR test and it's still a lab-driven test. And so that's why we're able to keep high levels of accuracy. As Bill was saying, kind of the 30-minute on the spot test result are the ones where you drop accuracy significantly. And so that's why we're not proposing that as a structure, but actually keeping a PCR test that we can still get turned around, we think, within about 24 hours. And so that is what we're partnering with districts to make available, and we have the capacity to do that. There are, of course, other testing sites people can utilize. And so I think the benefit is our structure is the only one that we know of that is being able to provide testing sites to schools on their school sites. There are obviously other drive-through testing sites and clinics people could use and of course are welcome to. I think our unique support is really designed to help schools be able to do it within the context of school functioning on their school sites.
Thank you. Question, is there any plan among any of the school districts to require or mandate vaccination for teachers or staff? I know for us, I'll answer for myself and then the others that no, we are not planning to require. I don't believe I can or should require vaccinations. However, once we have the opportunity to be vaccinated, we will move to school and continue school moving forward and believe that will be a significant step to ensure safety for our students and staff moving forward. Any other superintendent want to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'll respond. In Littleton Public Schools, our Teachers Association recently did a survey of the teachers asking that exact question. And interestingly, the results came back incredibly positive, well above 80%, which is well above the national, I believe, rate of interest in taking the vaccine. So we're excited that most of our staff is very interested in the vaccine as soon as they can get it.
And I would echo similar thoughts to both of you. We do not believe we'll be making it mandatory. We also feel it's a critical layer in the protection of our teachers and staff. So we want to value that side, give opportunity of access, and it'll also allow us to be in person much quicker and much better with that opportunity.
Thank you. Related, but an interesting turn in a question. Are any superintendents on this call planning to cancel any district-wide assessments tests this year? And I think we may want to just take that opportunity to expand that in our advocacy around CMAS or any other assessments. And I'll just start with saying the technical difficulties will be nearly impossible. To operate any CMAS test this year, I will need to pull back all the computers we've distributed to students to qualify for free and reduced lunch in February to get them ready to test in March. I find it difficult that I potentially would have to take computers back from kids that may need them at their home to be able to fully engage in their education so that we can assess after nearly 8 months of being in this pandemic. Any other of my colleagues have thoughts?
Yeah, we're hopeful that our advocacy around the suspension of state and national tests will get some action. It is a tremendous challenge, as Scott said, to reel in all of our laptops and our devices to actually engage in online testing. But I would also say there's something more important than the testing, and that is the time given back to teachers to actually offer instruction. We've lost lots of instructional time in days this year, and if we were to suspend testing, our teachers would actually get to spend more time in instruction with our kids, which we believe is the most important piece.
Thank you. Pretty wide open question. What do you need most from the state to reopen and stay open? I'll let my colleagues jump in.
Scott, I'll jump in first on that. I think some of the messaging that we've heard recently has been tremendously helpful about school as a safe place. There's not a lot of incremental risk is a term that I've heard Dr. Berman use for staff and students in a school setting compared to their community setting. I think there's been a lot of recognition that school and in-person experience is tremendously important for child development in all of its dimensions. What's often been missing is this recognition that at high incidence rates, the amount of quarantine activity that we have and the inability to staff our schools can leave us short, even in a place that's safe and productive and the best way to educate our kids. When we have really high rates of incidence, we're not able to do that. So more messaging to our state about if you value schools, if you value consistent in-person schooling, it's not going to be solved solely by the expanded testing that we've talked about today. It's not going to be solved solely by revised quarantine standards or vaccinations that'll be forthcoming. We have to, as a community, bring down the incidence and not have students and staff coming to school when they think they just have a cold, and it turns out that they have COVID, and they're taking out 8 or 9 teachers at a time. I think messaging that consistently in the weeks ahead will be tremendously helpful, and hopefully reducing the rates and getting us back in the saddle again.
And I'd like to jump in. Chris, I think you did a fantastic job explaining that. You know, I think the other things that would be fantastic is to collaborate together. I think in these difficult times, we can jump to the negative. So how we can work to fill more substitute positions. So parents, community members apply to be substitute teachers, apply to be bus drivers, apply to be educational assistants. Those things within our system to help us be operational and continue to sustain that is going to be critical. So the more we can fill those gaps together, work together, I think is a necessity. The more we can advocate for each of these schools and these roles to fill in the gaps, that'd be as a state, as a federal system, and also in our local base would be instrumental also. So just asking and being aware and then stepping up and being an active, positive participant in this would be greatly valued, I think, by all of us.
I'll jump in there as well. So as you've heard from all of us, everyone, operations was the reason why we had to make that model change in November from in-person learning to 100% remote. And as Corey just stated, very specific ask would be for CDE to waive the fees around substitutes. It would be great if we could find our community members who wanted to get their substitute license and come into our schools and help us with that operational capacity. So please waive those substitute fees.
Thank you. Question: in a needs assessment recently conducted by CDE and the Colorado Education Initiative, teacher mental health and burnout was identified as a top area of concern. What are superintendents on this call doing to support teachers who are tremendously stressed as they wrap up first semester? Thoughts from the group.
So again, this is Corey Wise of Douglas County School District. First and foremost, our teachers are critical. We said thank you earlier, but I don't think that's enough to understand everyone's working so hard this semester. This year has been like no other. So I think as we start to talk about what are we doing to support everyone in this situation, we have to go back to each individual, how we recognize and notice what each person's taking on, notice what people are struggling with, and then try to assist. Building in support so we can look at this next spring and do it better and sustain. So less transition, trying to understand, and also just slowing down to recognize. I think that's critical. So I think in each of those we're getting better, but there's also going to be new things that are going to happen to us in the spring. And as we transition and change, that's difficult. So it's not only during the typical work of teaching and learning within our schools, but all the other changes are impacting us. So we need to be strong. We need to take care of each other. We need to reach out and be a support to others, and also let others support us, because everyone is struggling. Our teachers, our staff, our families, our students. And I think we have to find those strengths to persevere.
Can I make a suggestion? I'm obviously not a school person, but I'll just reflect that in medical care, which is where I work, just in a couple of days, the day we've had access to vaccination, that's a boost to the same kind of issue. We have nurses who are exhausted, doctors who are exhausted, custodians, et cetera. And it has been, even in just 24 hours, a noticeable boost to have access to vaccination.
Thank you. And that leads into a good question. What kind of response have you received from the state health officials when advocating for teachers to be prioritized in phase 2?
So I think in all our discussions and participation with CDPHE, with the governor's office, the task force, and our local health agencies, I think there's a lot of recognition of the value of teachers and staff and our schools. I think when we look at how do we get the number of vaccinations into our state, when do we get those, and how do we allocate, is something that I think those health departments and the governor's working on. So I think finding that plan, gaining more access and availability into our state of the vaccinations, and then how we get those out in appropriate, timely manner and accessible to those groups, I think is a critical piece. So again, I know it's being worked on. I don't want to claim to know the answer of what they're doing, but I think advocating to, again, prioritize the most critical groups in our teachers and staff of schools, especially at their youngest level, to us is critical, and it's paramount in our community, but it's also paramount to our student learning.
And just to add on that, as a reminder for everyone, there are 2 doses needed. So by prioritizing our teachers and staff, if we could get that dose to them early, February, let's say, we will still have a whole nother month before that second dose. That is when it is going to take its effectiveness. So just know that the longer that we wait to vaccinate our teachers and staff, if we delay, it really will not help us this second semester of our school year.
Thank you. And we've had great support from the Metro Denver Partnership for Health in our conversations, and appreciate being a part of the conversation. I would love to have that commitment that our teachers, our frontline educators, are at the top of phase 2, so that we can remain in school and finish this year in ways that we couldn't finish last year, and contemplate things like graduation ceremonies or Life of Right events in different ways, so that another group of seniors don't lose those opportunities. And that would be a difference maker in those conversations. So with that, I think we've gotten through all our questions. I want to thank my colleagues, Mike Johnston from Gary Community Foundation and COVID Check, Dr. Berman from the Metro Denver Partnership from Health, and all the superintendents here on this call and around the state for the incredible work that you have done. It's an honor to serve with you. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.